G'day IB Psychologist. If you're doing your EE, you might have watched the previous video I made where I gave this kind of model for making a perfect extended essay research question. We start broad and we get specific. Now in this video, I want to give you 3 examples of how that process happens. So I'll give you one example from a couple of years ago. Psychopathy, a really important topic. Some people discourage students from doing it, but I don't see why. One pitfall, if you're interested in psychopaths, don't talk about serial killers or anecdotal, like famous examples. That is a big pitfall with writing about psychopathy. But treating it like like any other psychological disorder is absolutely fine. So the student came to me and she said, "I want to study psychopathy." I said, "Great. What do you want to know?" "I'm not sure." Okay, so she went away and read about it, came back in a couple of weeks and said, "Right, I want to know, well, what causes psychopaths? Like, how does it start? Why do people become psychopaths?" I'm like, "All right, cool, that's awesome." Again, go away, do some research, find me 10 studies about the causes or the origins of psychopathy, and then come back and check in. And I like giving students that very specific direction, right? Find 10, put a number on it. Right, you might want to say 5. Now what that does is it makes sure that there's enough research on that topic. Now I know there's enough research on the cause of psychopathy, but if you're not sure if there's enough research, then ask the student to go away, find 10 studies and come back and see what they've got. In that process, they'll either find, yep, there's enough research, or no, there's not. They'll find something different, or they might have, in the course of reading about those studies, found a different track to go down. So I did that with a student. She came back and she said, well, what I found out was that most of the studies are done on people in prison. And I said, "Oh, that's pretty interesting." And then she said, "Well, I want to know, why are there a lot of psychopaths in jail?" So I said, "Okay, that's great, right? Go away and answer that question." And then the next step of the question was she realized that actually there's a lot more male psychopaths in prison than female psychopaths in prison. And then that was her final question that she wanted to answer. And then she got into the difference in genetics and the difference in behaviors of the different genders of psychopaths, the diagnosis, I think even into differences in the brain. And this really, really good essay. It was 1 mark away from an A. But it was a great essay, and that's how that process evolved. She started with psychopaths. Now, I had no idea that there was more male psychopaths in prison than females. I mean, I could guess, but that's not something I knew. That was a perfectly organic way that the EE evolved. And that's what I like to see in the EE process. Now, feel free to disagree, and if you like giving your kids the specific questions from the outset, who am I to tell you any otherwise? But I think that defeats the purpose of the EE. It's a genuine chance for inquiry for students to choose a broad topic, and then they go down the path, and we're just guiding them, helping along the way. Now, if I don't think there's anything wrong with giving some specific hints about or some terminology to use when they're searching, and I do that quite a lot, and we'll see that in this next example. All right, student comes to me and says happiness, right? Because often psychology is a lot of like doom and gloom and like depression and disorders and everything goes wrong. Criminology, it all seems to be negative stuff, and possibly this is why the positive psychology movement emerged. But she said happiness. Why are some people really happy and other people aren't? I'm like, great, yep, cool. That's a field of psychology. That's something to ask. Go away, do some reading, find out about happiness. What can you find? Now, in this stage of the research process, I'm perfectly fine with students using just general media articles like Psychology Today. They don't have to be peer-reviewed journals. Often, articles that are written in the general media are good for this first initial wide reading stage. So go away, do some reading, come back to me. All right, and then so what she found out was social media and thinking, okay, there's a link there between social media and happiness. So she took the topic and then narrowed that into a very broad question. How does social media influence happiness? I'm like, that's great, awesome. Now you go away and do the research. Now you use the peer-reviewed journals, find 10 studies. Now at this point, I gave her the tip. I said, maybe include in your search subjective well-being, because psychologists don't use the term happiness, we use the term subjective well-being. Now I don't mind, it's basically the same thing, but there I've just given her a little tip, given her some terminology that she might use. It makes it a little bit easier, but I don't think it defeats takes anything away from the research process. Right, now in the course of the research, come back and said, right, social comparison, found out about social comparison and how that happens, how that can influence our well-being. And then she asked the question, does social comparison on social media influence subjective well-being? One final tweak to the question was, to what extent, adding that phrase in the beginning, to what extent does social comparison on social media influence the subjective well-being of teenagers? Now that is a very good research question. All right, so we move away from happiness, and now we get into murder and violence, right? It's a common one. I do the criminology unit quite early in my course, and so that often, that's about the end of that unit when students are choosing the EE topic, so that's often why I get a lot of psychopaths and criminal violence questions. Student comes and says, violence, why are some people violent? Why are some people more violent than others? And a very broad question like that is a great way to begin. Again, go away, do some wide reading, read anything you like on that topic from any source, then come back and we'll talk about it. Okay, they come back and talk about it, and they say, what causes people to commit violent murder? Again, really broad, but I'm fine with that because we're very early in the process. And this is why you should start the EE process early. The more you can do early on, the more reading, and the more the student can do the wide reading and narrow that question as soon as possible, the better. Right? But you're not going to start with that really narrow question. That's my point. That's the whole reason I'm going through these examples. You start broad, and it's only through the reading and that going away, doing some reading, doing some research, learning some more about the topic, coming back, tweaking it, adjusting it. That's how you get to the narrowed focus question. So whenever a kid comes to me and says, or someone in the Facebook forum say, is this a good extended essay question? I really want to say, well, it depends. Is this day 1 or is this day 100? Right? If it's day 1, it's fine. If it's day 100, well, then you've got to get them to hurry up. But again, we still shouldn't be just giving them a specific answer. Sorry if I'm beating that dead horse, but it drives me a little bit nuts. But please, I don't want to discourage anyone from asking about extended essay research questions because I know we all need help. So I'm not going to get grumpy if people post a question. I might just post a link to this video or another video instead of answering it. But everyone else chime in. It's fine. We all do things differently. Okay, and so then after going away and doing some research, the student came back and said, right, genetics, I can see there's a genetic link. I want to focus on that particular variable. And that's often how this question gets narrowed from going from a very broad independent variable, like what causes, why I don't have any particular thing. Okay, the biology of violence. Okay, now I'm going to get into genetics. And then one step further that is a very specific gene. And again, that could be where we can give some guidance to the student. Not give them the question, but I might say, okay, here are a couple of genes that are linked to violence, right? And so we might say, okay, go have a look at the warrior gene. And then, so now ideally they might find that out by themselves, but I don't see any harm in giving those little tips about specific things that might help narrow their question, not giving them the whole research question. Right? I think there's a very important distinction there. So we can see again, this went from a very broad research question to what causes violent murder to, now I'm going to make sure I get this right. Oh, how and why is the LMOA gene linked with violent murder? Okay, and again, we see that how and why. So the how there means this, the first part of the essay is going to be establishing the argument that it is linked with violent murder. And then the second part is going to be the why, but then it's also going to have in the critical thinking. Right, so you could ask that question, to what extent is the LMOA gene linked with violent murder? That's one way to ask it, but it doesn't have to be. You can get just a good essay by saying how and why. Right, so there are 3 examples from 3 different topics: happiness, psychopathy, and violence. And then we can see the process of starting broad and getting very specific. I really hope the logic makes sense. I really hope that those examples help solidify what I'm trying to say here, which is we shouldn't be giving students a research question or giving them very specific questions from the very beginning. They have to be the ones that are tweaking the research question as they go along. That's such an important part of the EE process because it involves really careful thinking. And they're going to learn so much about research and how to ask their own questions and answer their own questions in the process, as opposed to us taking shortcuts. So the process I suggest is you start with a broad topic, and then you do a little bit of wide reading, and then you find a general question, and it can be as broad as you like, and then you just, as you find out more and more information and you get deeper into the topic, you keep tweaking it and evolving it and getting a specific question. And now, the whole to what extent. I think there's nothing wrong with asking how or why questions. Why do people like the to what extent, and all the EE examples in the guide are to what extent for psychology? It drives me nuts. The reason is because the to what extent embeds the critical thinking into that essay title. You're going to say to what extent, it allows, or it suggests that the essay is going to have that counter argument. Well, it doesn't always, and here are the possible counter arguments. But I've got nothing wrong with a how or a why question. Right? How does X influence Y? Why does X cause Y? And that's fine. And then, because in the essay yourself, you have the argument. I don't think you always need to have the to what extent question. And we saw that with the earlier example. Why are there more male psychopaths in prison than female psychopaths? Right? Now, to turn that into a to what extent question, to what extent are there more? I mean, now it doesn't make any sense. The why is the detailed explanation, but that's not stopping the student from arguing against the answer of why. Well, okay, it could be because this, but this, right? It could be because of genetics, but it could be because of diagnosis, but. So nothing wrong with how or why. Do avoid what questions, because what can be just pretty descriptive. Descriptive. I had a student, their first question was, what is the difference between psychopathy and sociopathy? And I said, okay, go away, do some research, find out about it. But then my job then was to steer them into a more analytical question, because that's just going to be a summary of the different characteristics of those two things, and that's not going to allow full marks. So that is where the role of the EE guidance steps in. All right, I hope that was helpful. If you are doing your EE, my advice, start broad, but read as much as you can, as early as you can, find as many studies as you can, and the sooner you can get through this process to narrow to a research question, the better, because then you can spend all the rest of the time actually writing the answer. Good luck.